Today's talk focuses on the Black experience in Georgia during the American Civil War. The role that Black men played in their own liberation, particularly in the U.S. colored troops, has received a great deal of attention. In recent years, scholars like Stephanie McCurry, Amy Morrell Taylor, Tavolia Glimpse, and others have made convincing arguments validating the agency of enslaved women in the struggle to overcome oppression and gain freedom. But in deep South states like Georgia, which the Union Army did not occupy until the last 12 months of the war, the challenge for enslaved people to help effect their own liberation was limited. Today, I'll start by making the case for the study of Blacks and other neglected people in Civil War historiography. Next, I'll give a brief recap of the situation in Georgia. The bulk of my talk will consist of two character sketches from my original research: a free Black man and an enslaved woman and their extraordinary efforts to gain freedom. Are you ready? Let's get started. Most of the first 100 years of scholarship on the Civil War focused on a rather narrow and often romanticized view of a time that I argue was the most sweeping and radical social, economic, and political revolution in our history. The lost cause myth has been the greatest impediment to a full understanding of this defining period. But the myth of the lost cause is just one of several biases that early historians of the war left us. Besides an overtly racist version of Civil War history that pushed a narrative of happy, contented slaves and benevolent masters enduring a war that had little to do with slavery, we must also consider the exclusion of women, children, the elderly, politicians, and even the common soldier from the prevailing narratives, at least until about 30 years ago. Do the numbers with me. Women represented half the population. Children and men not of fighting age were a significant number. Slaves represented over 40% of the population in most Deep South states. Bottom line is that 2.8 million men served as soldiers in the war, and that is less than 10% of the total U.S. population. Of course, those who did serve, less than 1,000 generals get most of the press. Here are some of the usual suspects. Even considering those 1,000 generals, less than half have been subjected to any sort of in-depth study. So the real story of the Civil War, the complete account of this momentous conflict, remains the greatest untold story in American history, despite the thousands of books already written on the subject. The family album of Civil War history needs to look more like this: Blacks, women, families on the home front, children, common soldiers, recent immigrants, all need our attention, as does the war's impact on the environment, mental health, and so many other topics. I also argue that the people who had the most at stake in this war were not the plantation owners who feared the loss of their property, nor the Southern people who stood to lose their way of life. It was not the Northern leaders who cherished the Republic and Union more than life itself, or the Northern businessmen who had been enjoying unprecedented economic prosperity in the decades leading up to the war. No, it was the Black people of our nation, North and South, whose very lives hung in the balance. It was their fate that participated in the conflict. For blacks in America, this war promised either freedom and citizenship or perpetual bondage and despair. By now, I hope you understand why I think it is so important to study the black experience in the Civil War. There are tremendous challenges in doing so. Free blacks, for example, left much shorter paper trails than their full citizen white counterparts. Of course, in the case of slaves, a huge population, even less primary source documentation is available. But we have enough to study, draw inferences, and in some cases, provide an intimate view of their experience, thereby understanding how they contributed to their own liberation. Early in the war, strange as it seems, blacks were placed outside the conflict by most everyone north and south. This was a war to be waged for white interests, conceived and organized by white political and military elites, and fought by white men. The situation in Georgia changed dramatically when federal forces took control of the coastal islands, causing hundreds of slaves there and in South Carolina to escape and join Union forces. At first, Lincoln and his generals stood by their previous policy of non-engagement with blacks, but political and military pressures were mounting. No longer was it merely a small group of radical abolitionists who were calling for black enlistment and a shift in the focus of the war toward ending slavery. Seeing women and children fleeing to so-called contraband camps, combined with the efforts of leaders like Wendell Phillips and journalists like Horace Greeley, caused more Northerners to sympathize with the plight of these refugees. The cry of union, with or without slavery, as Lincoln had earlier espoused, was starting to look like a morally empty cause. The prospect of using blacks to augment white forces and help win the war on the battlefield ultimately proved both motivation and justification for Lincoln to use the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation issued in September 1862. Of course, the most hazardous way to self-liberate was to escape. As the war progressed, Union armies penetrated further south, creating opportunities for more slaves to flee to federal lines. By 1863, as many as 60,000 refugees were assembled at one spot. They were predominantly women, children, and the elderly. When the Union Army moved, commanders were reluctant to carry this massive additional burden with them. Contraband camps were often left behind as easy prey for Confederates and guerrillas to attack and force recent escapees back into slavery. Since the war came so late to the Georgia interior, blacks had limited ways of working for their own liberation. Some purposely rendered inefficient labor or even engaged in subtle sabotage when forced to manufacture supplies for the Confederate Army. Enslaved people and free blacks also assisted Union men and Confederate deserters. In my thesis on Unionists in Civil War Floyd County, Georgia, I came across numerous examples. Willis Carr, a slave of Unionist Elijah Carr, played a key role in this effort along Georgia's border with Alabama. One dark night in May 1864, Carr helped transport Elijah's two sons 15 miles and across the Coosa River so they could escape to the federal lines. A few months later, Carr guided a Union spy to the house of William Matthews, another strong Union man. Carr's master advised him that he need not run away, since the end of the war would result in his freedom. Although this white slave owner and his black slave may have had different motives for supporting the Union cause, they relied on each other for protection. Such informal exchanges of privileges and services between certain slaves and white Unionists played an important role in aiding what was a dispersed and often underground Union minority. Of course, the most visible act of self-liberation by recently enslaved Americans was the nearly 180,000 men who joined the U.S. colored troops and served alongside other refugees who provided manual labor to the U.S. government. Now, there are dozens of great books available on that subject. Because Union occupation of most of North Georgia and Alabama did not start until the spring of 1864, those two states, along with Florida, saw relatively few black soldiers compared to other regions where black men enlisted in large numbers. One notable exception from my study area of Floyd County was 22-year-old Hubbard Pryor, an enslaved man from Rome who escaped and made his way to Chattanooga sometime after the Union Army conquered that town in November 1863. In April 1864, Pryor enlisted in the 44th U.S. Colored Troops, only to be captured near Dalton in October, placed in a holding pen, and sold back into slavery. One must dig deeply to find enough records to construct a narrative on the black experience in the Civil War. I'd like to share two stories I uncovered and published in a terrific regional magazine called Georgia Backroad. You can download these articles free on my website. The first story features William Higginbotham, a free black man in the city of Rome, Georgia. He ran the Choice Hotel downtown, which catered to an elite white clientele. Higginbotham was an unusual black man in antebellum Georgia. Born free in Virginia in 1817, he lived in eastern Mississippi before he moved to the new settlement at Rome in 1845. By 1860, he had a personal estate worth more than $10,000 and had loaned others nearly twice that amount. In the aftermath of the first significant Confederate victory of the Civil War, the Rome, Georgia press tried to create the impression that the entire community, including black men like William Higginbotham, was behind the rebel government. The truth, however, was quite different. Higginbotham did not go to Virginia imbued with a sense of patriotism for the new Confederate nation. He went to free his enslaved children. Higginbotham's wife and children were the slaves of Dr. Homer Miller, a surgeon in the 8th Georgia Regiment. Dr. Miller insisted that he would only sell Higginbotham's children to their father if this proud black man would serve as Miller's personal servant on the battlefield. Higginbotham agreed and purchased his children in 1862. He was never allowed to purchase his wife. Higginbotham's prominence in Rome's business community made him an important symbol to other blacks in the county. Dr. Miller's secret bargain was carefully crafted to use this black leader as a tool, not only to suggest Rome's Confederate solidarity, but also to help dispel persistent fears of a slave uprising in the area. The agreement may not have been as one-sided as it seems today. Higginbotham was an abolitionist and could use his money, his influence, and even the feigned appearance of loyalty to protect himself from the most violent secessionists and keep his family safe. I was superior in my education to a large majority of the colored people, Higginbotham later explained. He arranged to have his nephew, a mixed-race boy named William Thompson, tutored in secret by local white teacher Peter Shibley. In 1860, Thompson entered Oberlin College in Ohio. He left school at the end of one term and eventually enlisted in Company K of the 10th Ohio Cavalry, serving in the battles of Chickamauga and also during Sherman's Atlanta campaign. Higginbotham remained at Rome and tried to balance his loyalty to the Union cause with his devotion to his business and his family interests. It was a precarious juggling act. I know we had to laugh in one hand and cry in the other, Higginbotham remembered, when the Yankees were whipped or when the rebels were whipped. Higginbotham's color protected him from serving a Confederate cause he did not believe in. His freedom to move about and communicate with enslaved blacks during the war helped sustain a black community that became more and more threatened. For most of Higginbotham's slave neighbors, the federal occupation of North Georgia gave them their first opportunity to aid the Union cause. In July 1864, a new Union regiment named the 44th Colored Infantry moved its headquarters to Rome and immediately sent recruiters out into the countryside. The response was overwhelming. In a short time, more than 800 enslaved men were recruited from farms and plantations across North Georgia and Alabama. The new recruits proved valuable in leading Sherman's army to the most productive plantations where he could find food and supplies for his hungry soldiers. General George Thomas reported that the desertion rate among black soldiers was surprisingly low, considering the fact that the ex-slaves were often cheated by bounty agents and mistreated by their white commanders. Despite the support they rendered to the Union cause, many Georgia blacks suffered depredations from both sides during the war. During the federal occupation of Rome in 1864, the Army used most public buildings for hospitals, warehouses, and other military purposes. All the churches in town suffered some damage during this period, but the black-owned Methodist Church was the only church in Rome demolished by the Federals who built a fortification on that site. As war enveloped Floyd County, blacks like Higginbotham faced increased pressure from the community. Rome's free blacks no longer enjoyed a relatively secure status by 1864. The editor of the Rome Weekly Courier had certainly changed his attitude towards Higginbotham from gratitude to resentment in 2.5 years, as you can read on this slide. What had not changed was the desire of the Courier's editor to spin his reporting to influence public opinion. Higginbotham was hardly thriving in the wartime economy. He made numerous loans in Confederate currency that would never be repaid. He and barber Billy Barrett were conscripted under orders to be taken dead or alive. They were only relieved of their forced and dangerous service of making gunpowder by the federal occupation of Rome. Higginbotham's property, like much commercial property in Rome, was damaged by the Union Army during the occupation. Sherman also destroyed some commercial buildings when he left in November. A gang of outlaws and Confederate deserters, led by Jack Colquitt, then moved in and committed violence on rebels, Union men, women, and children with little regard for politics. Remembering these tragic events years later, Higginbotham remained cautious. "To tell half of what I know," he warned, "I could not live here 24 hours." Like many of his white Unionist neighbors, Higginbotham felt even less secure after the war ended. Confederate neighbors harbored resentment towards Union men and blacks for generations to come. Higginbotham used his money, his position, and his influence in the white and black communities to do what he could for the Union cause, but his primary concern was safeguarding his family. In this respect, his experience was not unlike many of his white Unionist neighbors, who tried to balance their political principles with the need to survive. Although Georgia's blacks had no real political or social standing, they made a small but important contribution to Unionist resistance during the Civil War. Afterward, their black faces were a constant and painful reminder to white ex-rebels of a brutal war that exacerbated racial tensions for generations to come. While some white Union men would eventually regain the trust and acceptance of their neighbors, blacks confronted a persistent racial animosity that could not be as easily erased. On the seacoast in Savannah, another unusual story gives us a glimpse into the lives of enslaved Georgians during the Civil War. Enslaved black women may have been the most powerless class of adults in the U.S. at this time, and yet there are countless examples of extraordinarily brave women risking their lives not only to gain freedom, but to help the Union cause. Here is just one of those stories. Charlie Lamar was always itching for a fight. Once arrested for illegally importing slaves, he quipped that, quote, "A man of influence can do as he pleases." Lucrative profits from blockade running led him to quit his commission as a colonel in the Confederate Army and return home. Savannah was landlocked by the Union occupation of Fort Pulaski and also feared General William T. Sherman's advance from the west. Lamar and other wealthy merchants rode out the end of the end of the war in a city full of blacks and imprisoned Yankee soldiers. And Lamar hated them all. Lamar particularly resented blacks and poor Irish folks who shared their meager food and provisions with captured Union soldiers at the makeshift prison at the corner of Hall and Whitaker Street. Here is a drawing of the prison grounds. On a given evening, a passing slave could be observed hurling a loaf of bread over the 20-foot stockade fence or sneaking a pail of milk through to the starving soldiers. Rachel Brownfield was just the type of favored slave that aroused particularly visceral emotions from Charlie Lamar. Despite her status as chattel property, she parlayed her intelligence and resourcefulness into several profitable business ventures in a town that was desperate for labor and services. One evening in 1864, Lamar intercepted Rachel on a mission of mercy. The result was predictable. Lamar did not need to ask Rachel where she was going that night. Slaves and free blacks had a curfew in the city. This uppity slave woman was up to no good. Lamar cursed loudly, kicked over Rachel's bucket, and scattered her relief package in the street. He then drew his sword and threatened to run her through if he ever caught her aiding enemy soldiers again. Had Lamar known the extent of Rachel's efforts on behalf of the Union prisoners, he might have killed her on the spot. Rachel Brownfield was born Rachel Ann Moore in the small community of Saltcatcher, South Carolina, on April 2nd, 1833. Her mother, Julia, was the slave of Irish immigrant Patrick Ryan, who landed in Charleston in 1827. Ryan was a middling farmer who raised and butchered cattle. Julia proved to be a shrewd investment, since she bore at least 9 slave children by various white men. Rachel's father was New Hampshire native John Moore, a white merchant and postmaster of nearby Gillisonville. Contemporaries describe Moore as having, quote, marked integrity of character and a high sense of justice. Although the rape of female slaves had become widespread across the South, Moore may have been troubled by his sins. He gave large sums of money to Rachel at various times, giving her options that most rural slaves did not enjoy. Moore's guilt may have been exacerbated when Rachel fell victim to the very same abuse and exploitation as her mother. Only 14, she gave birth to Julia, the first of 3 children fathered by local white farmer John Saunders. Faced with a growing family under such dire circumstances, Rachel began hiring out her own time. An opportunity for Rachel to improve her circumstances came in 1850, when Ryan moved his family and his slaves to Savannah. Rachel found that this new environment offered her young family more than just financial opportunity. Savannah had developed a vibrant black subculture despite local and social constraints. Slaves and free blacks worshiped in both black and integrated churches, ran businesses that catered to white customers, and even attended clandestine schools. If there was any chance of real family life for slaves in Georgia, Savannah offered a glimmer of hope. The Roman Catholic vicar John Francis Kirby married Rachel Moore to the slave Charles Brownfield. Like other slave marriages, the union had no legal standing. 2 years later, Rachel and her children were sold to Dr. Eldridge Williamson of Macon, who allowed them to stay in Savannah. As long as Rachel paid Dr. Williamson for her time, she could work as she pleased, and Dr. Williamson would safeguard her money in the bank. By the time Dr. Williamson sold Rachel and her daughters to Savannah attorney Young Anderson in 1860, the enterprising slave woman had accumulated several $1,000s. Most was held in a bank trust transferred to her new owner. Anderson was a bright young man with a promising future, but war loomed on the horizon. The conflict erupted, Savannah's population swelled, and thousands of soldiers and sailors were called to defend the coast. Rachel took advantage of the need for rental housing by leasing this mansion on Bryan Street from local merchant Isaac Meinhardt. She paid Meinhardt $10 per month and provided room and board to both white and black lodgers. The business made her wealthy. At this point in her life, Rachel Brownfield faced an important yet difficult decision. She had enough money to purchase herself and her children, but dare she attempt it? The number of antebellum slaves who bought their own freedom may never be known. The process was fraught with obstacles and risk. Georgia law required freed slaves to leave the state within a year of gaining their freedom. So Rachel might have to leave her mother and even her husband if she became free. Other hurdles to real freedom were the legal restrictions placed on free blacks in most southern cities and states. Free blacks in Savannah, for example, had to register, appoint white guardians, and pay a tax on a strictly limited array of licensed occupations. But freedom was to most every enslaved person a fervent dream. Rachel made an agreement with Anderson in February 1863 to purchase herself and her children for $1,900. Anderson promised that his wife's family would return the money if he happened to die before the obligation was paid. So Rachel continued to rent rooms, sew, and take in washing. She paid Anderson for her time, plus $12 a month to hire out her daughters, Julia and Caroline. She made regular payments of several $100s each in gold, silver, and bank bills against her emancipation debt. Meanwhile, Union prisoners in Savannah and Andersonville lived in conditions that Professor Jacqueline Jones described as, quote, death camps. Rachel made numerous visits to the Savannah stockade. On one occasion, she was threatened by armed guards who took the tobacco and clothing she had brought for the captives, claiming that Confederate soldiers were suffering too. At this point, Rachel decided to take the ultimate risk. She would help the starving Union soldiers escape. Now, overcrowded conditions, hasty construction methods, and the occasional sympathetic guard made escape attempts from Civil War prisons fairly common. Union men, free blacks, slaves, they all conspired to aid escapees as well as deserters. They established networks of safe houses and guided escaped prisoners to safety behind the federal lines. Rachel Brownfield's boarding house was one of these way stations. The house on Bryan Street boasted 16 rooms. The 18 by 30-foot dining room was covered with an ingrain woolen carpet and featured a large leafed mahogany dining table. Black and white renters ran the gamut, from slaves working their own time in the city to Confederate naval officer Robert Bain. Boarders dined on fine china services and slept in rooms decorated with walnut and mahogany furniture. The secret occupants in the Brownfield boarding house, however, enjoyed no such luxuries. Concealed during daylight hours, even their nighttime activities were strictly circumscribed. A pair of escaped soldiers stayed 2 months before Rachel paid a local river pilot $20 in gold to transport them to Fort Pulaski. In May 1864, 6 more arrived. Rachel played a dangerous game of hide and seek with local authorities as rumors of her concealed guests swirled about the town. One boarder, Anne Rose Alexander, a slave washerwoman, encountered a prisoner one evening. Old Auntie Abby told me they were Yankee prisoners, and then I got into the secret of it and felt scared, she later recalled. If they had caught those people, there would have been a rope around Rachel's neck. City officers made a visit to the Brownfield boarding house to search for Union prisoners and found nothing. Whispers that Rachel was harboring escapees, however, persisted. Meinhard raised her rent tenfold to $100 per month, thinking this would force her to leave. But she paid the new rent rather than expose her secret and endanger both herself and her hidden boarders. I did this from charity, Rachel explained years later. In the meantime, Major Young Anderson, a quartermaster in the Confederate Army, had seen his law practice dissolve and his prospects diminished. on September 24th, 1864, Rachel paid him the final $550 to secure freedom for herself and her children. Anderson reneged on the deal. The final payment was in Confederate money, he explained. And besides, Rachel and her children were now worth more. He demanded another $1,800, or she could, quote, go up the country and fare the same as the rest of the Negroes do. Rachel refused. So Anderson went to the bank and withdrew all of her savings. Anderson then tried to sell Rachel to Isaac Meinhardt, but his price was too high. Anderson's nephew also refused to buy the slaves. As Sherman's army closed in on Savannah, Confederates abandoned the city on the night of December 21st, 1864. The initial reaction of Savannah blacks to their deliverance was unrestrained joy. General Sherman was treated as the hero of a long-awaited jubilee. At the Brownfield boarding house, however, the celebration subsided quickly. Sherman's army was hungry after living off the land for 5 weeks. Soldiers set up camp in the square directly in front of the boarding house. Captains McIntosh, Lieutenant Grover, and other officers commandeered the house, leaving Rachel and her children one room. For 2 weeks, Rachel and her daughters cooked and waited on the Union officers while Union troops ransacked the property. The 6 newly liberated former prisoners tried to stop the pillaging, but Rachel and her boarders lost everything. Captain McIntosh said it was a shame the way the army had treated her and promised receipts for the damages. They never materialized. She did more than any 2 women in town for the Union prisoners, testified former slave butcher Thomas Stewart. Despite risking her life for such harsh rewards, Rachel insisted that she would do it again tomorrow. Rachel and her husband set out to rebuild their lives after the war. There would be no more money coming from her white father. Sherman had burned Gillisonville, and John Moore's fortune was gone. Her former master, young Anderson, wounded at Cold Harbor, had died the following spring. So Rachel brought suit against his estate to recover the freedom ransom. Now, Rachel had a strong case. White men like Confederate naval officer Robert Bain, Orrin Lee, and her former master Patrick Ryan all submitted affidavits that supported Rachel's claims. Signed receipts from Anderson detailed the payments Rachel had made to her master. Judge Lloyd and Freedmen Bureau Chief Hogue agreed that the claims were valid. Years passed with several lawyers taking the case, but Rachel never recovered her money. But Rachel Brownfield was nothing if not resilient. She rebuilt her modest fortune in the years after the war by speculating in real estate. Cancer of the uterus finally claimed Rachel Brownfield just a month after her 51st birthday in May 1884. At her death, she left her 5 surviving children 3 properties and more than $1,000 in cash. She also made provisions for the education of her youngest son. The balance of her estate was left in the hands of her executor to ensure that her legacy endured. As a lasting symbol of her defiance to the slave-owning society that had taken so much from her, Rachel willed that the remainder of her estate be used for the care and adornment of her lot and gravestone in Laurel Grove Cemetery. There she gazed northward in perpetuity toward important white people like Charlie Lamar, who were buried in a separate section. Although bound together by economic necessity and life, Savannah's whites nevertheless insisted that they be segregated from their black neighbors even after death. Now, before we get to the questions, I just wanted to announce that I'll be donating $10 for every book sold today to the Civil War Roundtable Congress.